Coming up on this week's show, one of the biggest FPS games ever arrives on the Spectrum.
A game that defined a generation comes to the Switch.
And we go inside Infocom with Mike Dornbrook.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each and every Friday with our amazing pals at Bitmap Books. Now, you need to check out their brand new book. Just landed, pre-orders begin on November 14th. I'm Too Young to Die, the ultimate guide to first-person shooters, covering that incredible genre from 1992 to 2002 and celebrating more than 180 games. We'll tell you more about that in just a bit, and you can check out the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. And with our friends at PCBWay. Now, you know PCBWay. They offer a fully featured custom PCB prototype service. They have low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards, and they offer services like 3D printing and injection molding, and they're huge supporters of the retro community. So you can get an instant quote for your project right now at PCBWay.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 351, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to our first show of November. Clocks have changed here in the UK. Even though we're recording this at like 9:30, it feels so late. Don't you think?
Oh my God, I thought it was like 11 o'clock. It's been a long night. It's been a long day.
You know, I didn't even notice because all the modern devices just change the clocks automatically. So you kind of just switched into a time zone. Apart from you've always got that one clock in your house, which is like,
for me, it's
windable. Oh.
Yeah, it's the cooker clock for me.
Talking about devices that did it, my Amiga 1200, I noticed change the time automatically the other day. I've got must have some tool in there that sync the time automatically. So pretty impressed with that. But I mean, obviously we're now into November. Those darker nights are here, and a good time to, snuggle in, get the heating on if you can afford it in your part of the world. We can't hear. And just play some classic video games. And this show celebrates all of that. I mean, everything from the Commodore 64 to the Sinclair Spectrum, the Sega Mega Drive to the Super Nintendo, the N64 to the PS1, all of that. And actually, sometimes we go really old school. Like in this week's show. Now, it's not very often that we get guests on where we think they need a good 2 hours to tell their career story. But this week and next week is definitely one of those examples, because we're going to go real old school and get the story in this part of our interview of Infocom. Now, if we're talking about legendary early video games companies, they do not come much bigger than Infocom.
Yeah, they're absolutely huge. And like today, we're going to be talking about text adventures as well, a subject that I really love to talk about. And, it's a genre that's kind of making a little bit of a comeback at the moment. But Infocom were the original kind of crew that were behind it when text adventures were on mainframes, and then they were going into personal computers. So we're talking to Mike Dornbrook, and he's going to be telling us all about Zork, which is a absolutely legendary title. And there was one bit where he's telling us about, the administrators getting really annoyed because everyone was playing Zork on the mainframes when they should have been doing work.
He's got a really interesting story. I mean, we're going to be doing this interview in two parts. I mean, today we're going to be talking about those days when he was at Infocom, how he kind of became one of their first, I guess, one of the first beta testers in the industry, really, before moving to work with them full time, and then working with, the likes of Douglas Adams on games like Hitchhikers Guide to the Galaxy, setting up their user groups and community groups and that kind of thing. And that journey from, like you mentioned, the kind of underground world of video games when it started on university mainframes, into getting these games into stores and then porting them to home computers. So that early part of his career is going to be the focus of this week's episode. And then after that, he had, a massive second chapter to his career when he worked for Harmonix and, of course, brought us games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band. So I think he'll agree, quite an accomplished career.
Yeah, what a varied career as well. Starting with text adventures and going to rhythm games.
It's such a varied career. And it blew my mind when you guys said that you had him on, and then Dan was like, oh yeah, he worked on Guitar Hero, and then he moved to Rock Band, which is obviously in part 2. And I was a massive Guitar Hero fan, 15 years ago, 17 years ago. And I was just like, that story there has absolutely baffled me and blown my mind. So I'm really, really excited to hear this 2-part episode.
And like also Zork is just such a legendary title. You know, we have a lot of people, and when they come on the podcast, they refer to either Colossal Cave Adventure or Zork as being like their first video game experience when we talk about, you know, the initial titles. So absolutely groundbreaking.
And even the fact that he mentions wherever he goes in the world, you'll generally meet someone who knows either Zork or Guitar Hero or Rock Band. You know, if you'll meet a group of 10 people, there'll always be someone to know, you know, when they ask what he's done. They're just games that became part of everyday life, really, aren't they?
Pop culture, Guitar Hero was. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, everybody, my mum, who has absolutely no idea about games, you know, still tells me to turn the Sega off.
There's even a Zork planet in Ready Player One, and you know, I think both of them were referenced on the Big Bang Theory as well. So, yeah, some really interesting stuff.
Yes, you're going to really enjoy this. The first of our epic two-part interview with industry legend Mike Dornbrook. He'll be on the show in around 25 minutes from now. And actually, it's quite timely that we've got Mike on the show this week because he's actually just worked on a re-release, which is a 25-year anniversary of one game that he worked on called The Space Bar. Now, that's actually just been re-released now, so we'll find out kind of what the story is there. He worked with Steve Moretsky on that, and its 25-year anniversary re-release has just dropped today when this episode comes out. So I'll obviously link that up in the show notes, and we'll hear more about that with Mike, who'll be on the show in just a bit. But of course, before we do that, we like to bring you up to speed on what's been happening in the world of retro gaming and technology from over the last 7 days. And I think it's fair to say it's been another manic week. It's a packed episode this week. So let's jump straight into this. Now, I remember friends of mine at school who had PCs. Some of them would ask their parents if they could upgrade from a 286 to a 386, maybe even a 486, so they could play Doom nice and smoothly on their machine. And then when we got to like 95-ish, we need to upgrade all over again. The Pentium's out now. I want to play Quake. And Quake all seemed like a really demanding title for the time. I must admit, I never thought I'd see the day that Quake was running on the lowly ZX Spectrum.
Yeah, this is majorly impressive. Like, actually, we've seen a like little alpha demo of it running at the moment, and it seems like it's just the kind of engine, a 3D engine around it. But it really reminds me, we recently had an interview with Incentive Software, so that was a 345 with Paul Gregory, and you know they were doing 3D stuff on the Spectrum as well. And I don't know much about the Spectrum, but it's a real interesting thing to see these kind of 3D worlds, and you know it's 3D abilities for such a limited system.
I would agree with you there, like a 3D world. I'm relatively familiar with Quake. I completed the re-release of it, the HD remaster of it last year. And, at a glance, would I say this is Quake? I don't know, like if I hadn't read the headline. But still really impressive to see it running on the Spectrum. And also on the ZX Spectrum. Also really cool that it is playable, as in like, you can go ahead and download it and actually run it on your original hardware. So it's been brought together by two coders. So a lone coder and also Dragon's Lord have put this out. So they're saying it works on the 3, the 5, the 7, and the 14 megahertz, but the 7 and 14 megahertz versions it will run faster on. I'm not a specky guy. I'm not too sure what that means to me. But
slow machines.
Slow machines, but it will run on the slower ones, it's saying, which is pretty cool. But you will get less flaws as well. On the slower machines, it says.
That was always a thing they did back in the day. Yeah, you take off the floor and ceiling of FPS games to make them run a bit smoother.
Oh, okay, that's pretty cool. So,
and yeah, there's like literally no wall textures or anything. But what do you expect? It's got some nice shading and stuff, and I'm amazed about the actual movement. He's got these bouncing blobs in there, which are pretty cool because it shows animation. There's no enemies or anything going around, and
I think they're meant.
Well, I think that they're meant to be the enemies from Quake.
They're meant
I think,
to be the enemies
from
like the first couple of levels. Yeah, if you
squint and look at them a bit.
Yeah, if you squint and look at them with your sunglasses on, maybe. But yeah, it's all in black and white. But I've got to keep reminding myself that this is running on original hardware, ZX Spectrum. Like, I'm like, oh, it's not that impressive, bit of a 3D engine. But then you're like, wait, even a 3D engine on the ZX Spectrum is really impressive.
This is a 40-year-old computer we're looking at this on. And that's the thing. I mean, even seeing first-person shooters running on like the Amiga back in the day was jaw-dropping. The fact that someone's got, it's not texture, but it is shaded 3D objects, a 3D maze that you can walk around with some animated enemies in there, I think is a massive feat of programming. So it is only a demo that you can download at the moment, and they're working on it all the time. But I think, just seeing an FPS game running this smoothly, because it does play very smooth for a Spectrum, and there is a free download link if you want to check out the demo in progress so far, and a YouTube video that I'll put in our show notes as well. You'll find that in your podcast app or at theretrohour.com. Now, one thing I loved back in the day is getting a nice hefty manual with my video games, and obviously it's nothing we get anymore. I mean, God, you're looking to even get the game on a physical edition now. I saw a YouTube video today talking about the latest Call of Duty game, that if you buy the physical edition on the PlayStation 5, it has a file on there that is a whopping 80 megabytes.
Oh, wow.
Literally, it's a key just to unlock it and download it off a server. So you don't even get the game on the disc anymore. Never mind the manual. You're looking to get a bit of paper in there. But even going back to, I'd say the PlayStation 2 era was probably the last time that we got a decent manual bundled in the box with games, wasn't it?
360, the next generation, was probably where it started to really phase out. But yeah, the 6th generation PS2, GameCube, Xbox, that was probably the last gen where it was it was expected, and then after that it started to become a bit there's no manual.
Yeah.
But yeah, that segues really nicely into this, and we actually covered a similar story a couple of months ago to this, where somebody had uploaded the entire SNES library of manuals and artwork onto an archive. But this is the PS2 archive, so it's every single US PlayStation 2 manual on archive.org in full 4K resolution, and I think it's just under 2,000 games on there, and it's been done by, from what I understand, one guy. So the Super Nintendo one was a bit of a collective, and maybe that's because it was harder to get that many games. Maybe to get every single Super Nintendo game, it's an older console, older hardware. The PS2, this guy, maybe he's been collecting it for a long time, because he goes on record to say that he actually scanned them all in himself, one by one, in his own home printer.
That's crazy.
Home scanner, which is just as a project, that is just insane, and just an absolute labor of love. And a little bit of me was a bit oh my God, he had to take the staples out of every manual and kind of take the manuals apart to scan them in and stuff like that. But I think the end result, you'll agree, does look really, really good.
Even doing that, even going through and taking the staples out of however it is 1,900 manuals, that's got to be a bit of pain on the fingers after a while.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just even just typing this up and just uploading them all and stuff, it just looks absolutely insane. I mean, I think he said it took him 7 years to do this or something like that.
I can believe it.
But the website, I'm on it now, and I'm just looking at stuff, and it's perfect. Every single game. I mean, I know it's the US game, so I'm not too sure how much of the difference there was between Japanese and PAL and stuff like that. But any game I can think of, such as Guitar Hero or Rock Band, speaking of today's guest, they're all on there. It's crazy.
He makes a good point here. He says, in future, I'd like to have AI do some reconstruction of text and maybe images, and also remove the staple holes and stuff like that. Because he's had to clean up a lot of stuff. When he scanned it, he's had to put it into Photoshop or something and play around with it. Yeah, I can imagine AI and a way of loading it would probably speed up this whole process.
Yeah, I mean, he uploaded just last year alone 75,000 pages. So yeah, if you're cleaning that up yourself, that's a full-time job. I don't know how he's done this. Maybe it is his full-time job.
Well, the entire collection comes in at 230 gigabytes before compression.
Oh, wow.
So he's uploaded them all to archive.org, of course, in full 4K resolution. I think it's a very useful service as well, because, I've generally bought a lot of kind of secondhand PS2 games. I definitely went through an era of buying them, probably around 5-6 years ago. And I'd say probably half the ones I bought secondhand just didn't have the manuals in there anymore.
Well, if you've got a PS2 with a hard drive in there or something, and you're loading stuff onto there, or you've got an EverDrive, stuff like this is essential. Also, back in the days when you used to get naughty copied games, a lot of people wouldn't have the manuals as well. So, you forget how important they are. Manuals have all the info in there. So, this is pretty awesome.
And I think the fact that he's now done, the collection, the entire US collection for the biggest selling console ever. Anything after that's got to be an easier job.
Oh, yeah.
So, he's already done the hard one. So if you want to check those out, they're available for free right now. Every US PlayStation 2 manual scanned in 4K on archive.org, and I'll link that up in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, there are not many games that a generation has been named after, but you guys may have heard of the Oregon Trail generation. Generally, you think in America, talking about kids that went to school in the early to late 80s who grew up on the game the Oregon Trail. Now, it wasn't as popular over here, but we're definitely aware of it in video game culture. I mean, it's kind of the equivalent as to, you know, I guess Granny's Garden was to kids that went to school here in the UK and played on the BBC Micro. But the Oregon Trail, obviously a legendary game, and I think, you know, we've had a lot of guests on as well. They all talk about having Apple IIs back in the day and playing this game, and I think it is definitely, you'd say, up there in the most legendary titles of all time.
I've not actually played it myself, but I do know it has that kind of legendary status as well. And you're right, it does seem very, very kind of American focused, but I'd love to actually have a go on it and check it out. Am I right in thinking it started off on like the Apple II and like systems like that, or the TRS-80 as well, which was a very popular system in the States?
Yeah, no, got a C64 port as well. I think it was on a lot of things back in the day. Very popular game stateside. And obviously it's kind of best known for, you know, the player dying of dysentery. That's kind of the meme that's come out the game in more recent years. But now it turns out if you've ever been curious about the game, or you've got strong memories of playing the Oregon Trail at school, they're now re-releasing a new updated version that is in many ways a bit of a sequel to it on the PC and the Nintendo Switch.
Yeah, they've really overhauled and revamped the graphics, because I'm the same as Ravi. I've never played the Oregon Trail, but I've heard of it, and I know, you know, kids in America played it in school, and it was the story of them going across America, wasn't it? And you kind of have to, it's an early, like, I don't want to say real time strategy. Yeah, but it's just an early strategy game, isn't it? As well, you have to like focus on like all your food and your farming and stuff like that, I believe.
Apparently, probably why they use it in schools, I guess, because it was that education.
Well, apparently, 65 million copies were sold of it as well.
There you go.
Which is, you know, a lot of people would have been touched by that game.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see if this makes its way into schools and stuff like that. And I'd like to quite give it a bash myself on the Switch, because the only versions I've seen of it are, like you say, like sort of C64. I want to say an original Nintendo copy of it I've seen as well, and you know, it's that really old school, like top-down pixelated map, and you kind of pick where you're going and stuff like that. So seeing it with this kind of like modern cel-shaded, kind of like indie style graphics, I know that's a bit of a broad thing to say, but it does look cool, and it's an educational game, and I want to play it. So that says something about it.
Well, again, this new version of it, they're promising it's going to be a bit of a successor to the original game with a modern twist on the trials and tribulations on the original Road to Oregon, with 15 playable journeys, 7 quests inspired by historical events, and that will take the player on exhilarating journeys, according to the publisher. And it's coming out on Steam and Nintendo Switch some point in November, apparently.
I was wondering, you know, they need to include the original, right? You know, they could probably just fit that in this whole
It doesn't
title.
say anything about that. I'm not sure whether they have.
Maybe not with licensing or something. Maybe they've got a license to do a new version. But I must say, like, looking at some of the footage, it looks really well done. Like the parallax and stuff looks pretty beautiful, and I kind of like the effects on there as well. I think it'll fit the Switch quite well, and hopefully bring it to a new generation.
And I think as well, it just kind of feels like one of those titles which, you know, I'm with you guys, because, you know, it wasn't really that popular over here from what I remember when I was a kid. I've never actually played it either. And it kind of feels like, you know, when you talk about, I'd say Oregon's Trail, if you're talking about maybe the top 20 best-known video games in history, it would probably be in there. And I kind of feel like, as a gamer, it's something I probably should have played at some point.
We should do an episode on it and actually, you know, get down and kind of learn this whole title.
Although I'm quite worried the fact that it generally was played by like 6-7-year-old kids in school. If we turn out to be terrible at it, what's that going to do for our
It'll probably be too hard for you anyway, Dan.
I was going to say, Mister's only ever completed like 3 games, so you've already lost your street cred, Dan.
I said less than 10. I didn't specify 3, Joe. Yeah, so if you want to check that out, it should be available at some point this month, they reckon, and I'll link that up in our show notes as well. We're going to talk about another incredible collection for the Nintendo Switch. If you played the Samurai games back in the day on the Super Nintendo C64 as well, and one of the best Commodore 64 mods if you're into SID music. We need to talk about this in just a sec. Before we do that, though, just a quick reminder that we know we're getting into that time of year when everything gets very expensive and you might have Christmas presents to buy and the bills are going up and everything. But just a reminder that, this podcast, we put it out free every single Friday for you. And this show will always be free. But if you can spare a couple of pounds, couple of dollars, couple of euros into helping us keep the lights on and keep bringing out this show every single Friday, any support we get on our Patreon makes such a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I say it every week, and I'm probably a little bit of a broken record, but we really, really are thankful that, people support us and that we are managing to keep the show going, keep the lights on in the studio, if you will. But we don't just, take. We do like to try and give back. We do every month that every tier, any tier that you join, does get you access to our hangout that we do on the last Sunday of every month. Now, I've heard this one was actually the busiest one we've ever had, and unfortunately, we've been doing this now for about 2 years, the hangout, and it was the first one I've ever missed because of my new job. I have to work the odd night shift, and it was my night shift on the Sunday just gone. But yeah, I heard it was a really, really good one.
I wonder if there's a connection there.
Yeah, maybe. They knew I wasn't going to be on it.
No, we did. We had a load of new faces on. Quite a few people from America dropped in as well that we hadn't seen before. So that was awesome. We had Dave, who's up in the Northeast, who came on for the first time as well. So it's always nice to see new faces. And I think you'll agree, we're a very friendly bunch, aren't we? We've got a great group of people on there. And we just completely nerd out. I mean, what kind of things were we talking about this week, Ravi?
We were talking about Chernobyl. For quite a while.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of stuff,
bunch.
but also the games that were like influenced by that. And, there was a whole kind of history, Stalker as well, which was one of the great Russian films that came out. And, some games were influenced by that as well.
And horror games.
Yeah. We were talking about absolutely everything as well, but Guitar Hero chat as well.
Yeah, so, we just nerd out for a couple of hours on the last Sunday of every month. And if you join us on Patreon now, of course, you'll get an invite to November's Patrons Hangout. We also do, for our gold members and above, an exclusive monthly podcast called the Retro Hour After Hours. And we've just recorded the latest episode of that. So if you join us this week, you'll get hold of that. And we're talking about our favourite console add-ons in this one. This was a fun one to do.
Yeah, this was really fun. And you know what? I actually struggled to pick my top 5 on this one. And I actually had to reach out to a couple of friends at work and say, what were your favorite ever video game add-ons? And I really got a load of the lads there really scratching their brains, shouting out some really cool suggestions. And then I thought, I'd heard them all from that. And then I came on to record with you guys, and some of the stuff you came out with just brought back so many memories and also blew my mind and also educated me a little bit. So it was really, really fun.
Yes, we dedicated a full episode to talking about our top 5 console add-ons of all time, so you can unlock that right now. And 29 episodes of the After Hours podcast. Plenty of listening, so if you join us on Patreon, you get access to all of those as well. You get the normal show ad-free each week. We do extra patrons-only content in there. We try and get out early to you if we can as well. So we give a lot back, and of course, for joining us on Patreon, we'll give you a shout in the Hall of Fame, hopefully on next week's show. Been a bit quiet on Patreon this week, but if you'd like to join us, all the details are at theretrohour.com. We hugely appreciate your support, and actually a very good time to join us because we're coming up to the end of the year. That means, boys, bill renewal time, website hosting, all of that coming up in January. So if you can help us out, now's a very good time to do it. Now, before we get into our guest this week, going inside Infocom with Mike Dornbrook, did you ever play the Samurai games back in the day, Ravi?
Yeah, I played First Samurai, which was on the Amiga, which was absolutely awesome title by do you remember Mev Dink, who we've had on the podcast before? And
Rafael Secco as well.
Yeah, and Vivid Image, that was the publisher. But this was a really good one because The Last Ninja kind of came out at the time, and First Samurai was like a nice alternative. I always remember the graphics were really, really high end and had beautiful backgrounds. It wasn't as kind of atmospheric, but the playability on there was really high up. A lot of people absolutely loved this, and I love that whole kind of fantasy world. I didn't play any of the later Samurai games, though.
Yeah, I played Second Samurai's one I played more. I've got to feel my brother had First Samurai on the Commodore 64, but I played Second Samurai more on the Amiga. And again, like you said then, I love the look of these games.
I didn't even I mean, the name kind of gives it away, but I just thought it was a quirky name. I never knew there was a first Samurai. I just knew there was a second Samurai for the Mega Drive. And it looks like a quirky game, to be fair. You know, I hate, like, I don't want to brand it as that, but it has got that real Amiga and Atari ST look to it. I kind of associate in my head.
Yeah, it's got the blitter effects in the background, you know, the kind of nice gradients and stuff. And it does look very Amiga, definitely. It's one of the titles that really shone graphically on the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is getting ported to the Switch, isn't it? A pack with both of them on, which comes...
It should be out now, actually.
Be out now, because it's coming out on the 3rd of November. So it would have come out yesterday, if you're listening to this on the day of release. I've never played them. They look good. They look fun.
Yeah, really good fun.
Yeah.
And I don't know how the music changes on the other ones as well. Because the Amiga, stuff always felt a bit plain, but I don't know if, you know, that's kind of what ports they've actually used for this.
I've got a feeling it's a SNES port.
Okay.
The
first one looks like, it looks like an Amiga game, and it mentions the Amiga game in the description on the website, so I'm looking at. It looks like it is the Amiga one, which is pretty cool. And it is coming out on Xbox and PlayStation as well, you know, PS4 and 5 and Xbox Series X and 1, which is cool as well. So not just the Switch. I might have to pick this one up because I love my Sega Mega Drive games, and I've not got Second Samurai, and this might be a cheaper, more accessible way to play it.
Yeah, it's only $8.99.
Oh wow,
it's a pretty decent price.
Yeah, that is a good price actually for these, you know, re-release games. And you know, I love my retro on new hardware.
Yeah, and it's a great platformer game. I mean, yeah, it's a bit of a hack and slash kind of game, really. I mean, from memory, there are some quite gory scenes in it as well. But I mean, for that price, for 2 games, you can't really go wrong. So that should be available now by the time the show comes out. £8.99 or €9.99. The Samurai Collection, if you're a fan of those classic games, definitely worth picking up this week. Now, you keep going on about this to me, Joe, and I thought, right, let's get this in the news this week. Because you wanted to talk about this bizarre Commodore 64 music instrument that's been made by a YouTuber.
I mean, I have absolutely no idea how he's made this. And not only has he made it like sound amazing as well. So this is a YouTuber who's made a Commodorian, which is 2 Commodores kind of hybridly mutated, fused together to make a fully functioning musical accordion, and it works really well, doesn't it, Dan?
Do you want to hear a bit of it?
Yeah.
Okay, this is what it sounds like. So this is off his video. Now, the clicky noise you can hear is actually him pressing the keys on the Commodore 64 that he's got in his right hand, and they're linked. I mean, you know, you normally get the bellows on an accordion. They're actually floppy disks.
Yeah, what he's actually done is he's taken the 2 keyboards and he's got some kind of bridge going between them. So he is actually playing them, and it is going into the C64 and using the SID chip. Like the Commodorian is pretty amazing, and that's what he's actually named his channel. Oh my God, this is amazing. What he's actually done is he's linked 2 C64s, or at least the keyboards. I can't quite work out the technology here, but
the whole thing's in there apparently.
The whole thing's in there. So he's got a bridge board between them, or some kind of board that's linking both of them, and then he's playing with the SID chips there. I don't know how they mix or how they kind of clash. He's pretty interesting. He seems to be doing a few C64 ones. Like previously, we wanted to talk about the Theremin as well that you did as well. So that's another one that you can check, which is amazing because he uses a spoon to kind of create a Theremin on the C64. So I wonder what instruments this guy's going to come up with next.
I mean, I don't know how true this is. I can't play the accordion, but my dad's always told me the accordion is like the hardest instrument to play in the world. Well, one of the hardest instruments, and
you need some strong arms to play the accordion.
And my dad's dad, so my grandfather, he was a musician, and he could play like anything, and he could play the accordion, and he used to always say it was like the hardest instrument to play. But as you guys say, what's amazing about this is the bellows in the middle, which are made out of floppy disks, aren't just for show. So one side controls the melody, one keyboard controls the melody, while the other is playing the chords, and then the bellows in the middle determine the volume of the volume and the pitch of it, which I guess is not too far away from a real accordion, so it's not for show or anything like that. It actually works.
And he's got a microphone on one end, and then it goes into a DAC, which is digital audio converter, and that kind of adds all the signals together and then outputs it at once. So I guess the outside microphone is also doing some extra work on there, but that is some spectacular work, isn't it?
Yeah, and if you want to check out the video, I mean, it's like 12 minutes long, and he kind of talks you through the entire process of how he's done it, and plenty of demos in there too. Even stuff that he's took into account, like they don't use normal power connectors, because obviously if you're putting it on your knee, if you're playing it sitting down, you don't want these, power cables digging into your lap.
All right, yeah.
So he's actually wired them up internally as well, and the audio output's picked up directly from the motherboard. So the thing about it is, I mean, it looks really cool, but the really impressive bit is how functional it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how, sturdy it is, because it's kind of made out of floppy disks and bits of wood. But, yeah, if you know what you're doing, that's pretty amazing. And I think the next project he should do is a light harp. With a C64, so you have light that you kind of hit in the air and then make some amazing music.
There's a project for you, Ravi, this week.
No, I'm not going to start doing instruments.
DJing's enough. So, if you want to check out his channel, I mean, he's done, like Ravi mentioned, several other Commodore 64 musical mods as well that are very impressive. I'll link that up. And all the rest of the stories, you don't have to Google around. If you hear us talk about something, you'll find them all on your podcast app, or just head to our website, check out the episode link at theretrohour.com. Obviously, we're all thinking about, Christmas presents for our family and all that. Maybe you get to this time of year. I don't know if your wife's the same, Joe. Or your mum starts asking you, what do you want for Christmas? And every year I'm like, I don't know.
Well, funny you should say that, because my wife has asked me already, and she says, you're not having any games. You've got enough games. So
you can never have too many.
Well, she's saying I've got too many. So how about some books about games, eh?
Oh,
yeah.
What about that for a link?
I'll get in there.
Now, if we're talking about books, of course, it is our incredible sponsor, our great friends at Bitmap Books, and their new book looks like one of their best to date. Now, you can pre-order this right now, and it starts shipping in just a couple of weeks on the 14th of November. And this is I'm Too Young to Die, the ultimate guide to first-person shooters. Now, this spans the FPS from, right in the early days of like Wolfenstein 3D and Doom when they came along, completely changed the industry, and it goes up to 2002. Now, you might be thinking, well, 10 years, but there are actually 180 games that they explore in here that defined that genre. And you think of that gap between, the original Wolfenstein 3D coming out to stuff like, Half-Life and going through GoldenEye, and obviously we had Halo coming out and Quake and Deus Ex, all of those games. So it was definitely, if you're going to explore the history of first-person shooters, that decade is definitely where you want to focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is essentially the first decade of, the first-person shooters, kind of like you say, from like Wolfenstein and Doom onwards. And it's just a really, really cool, fun insight of those kind of like 10 years of that genre, which is now just like absolutely colossal, with like Halo and Call of Duty and stuff like that, but just kind of see like the roots of it all and, how it kind of developed over those 10 years is really, really interesting. And, it's physical media, it's really, really good quality. And as always with Bitmap Books, it is an absolutely beautiful book with absolutely beautiful artwork.
Yeah, it is literally a work of art, their books. They're gorgeous. And there's also legends in here as well. If we're talking about first-person shooters, John Romero, he does the foreword in the book as well. They've got the legends in there like Ian and Chris Andrew, the Freescape games, Scott Miller from Apogee and 3D Realms, David Doak, of course, GoldenEye and Time Splitters, and many more as well. So that is available now, a 424-page gorgeous hardback book printed to their usual high standards. If you're a fan of first-person shooters, pre-order this right now. And, of course, support our sponsors. It really means a lot to us and the podcast as well. And treat yourself to this. It looks gorgeous. The book's called called I'm Too Young to Die, The Ultimate Guide to First-Person Shooters, 1992 to 2002. And you can pre-order that right now for delivery in a couple of weeks' time. And, of course, check out the rest of their books at bitmapbooks.com. And a big thank you to Sam and the team at Bitmap Books for their continued support of our show. Okay, the next part one of our epic two-part interview, this time going deep inside the world of Infocom and those old-school text adventures with our special guest, Mike Dornbrook. He's next on the Retro Hour podcast. You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and it is time for the main event then, when we welcome on this week's very special guest. And our guest this week has experience dating right back to the earliest days of the video games industry, working for some legendary companies on some legendary games as well. And hopefully we're going to try and cram as much of that history into the next hour as possible. So let's, without further ado, welcome on our special guest this week, Mike Dornbrook. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Very good, thank you. Now, as I mentioned, just the breadth of different companies and products and eras that you've worked in. It's just a fascinating history on paper, so I can't wait to get some of your memories. I mean, kind of going back to the early days then, I mean, I read that you were working for MIT's Lab for Computer Science. I mean, let's start your journey there. What kind of led to that then?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, so I think a couple friends of mine who were fairly heavily involved at the lab at that point, Mark Blank and Joel Perez, who had started Infocom, among the others who started it, were worried about the fact that I was kind of in a rut. I was running the film program at MIT and not being paid anything and just doing some odd jobs on the side. And they wanted to get me into something a little more stable. So they somehow talked Al Veza, who was running the group that they were involved in, to hire me, even though I knew nothing about computers. They said that basically it would be a good experiment to get someone who'd never learned a computer language to learn Muddle, which was the language they were working in order to be, I wouldn't be biased or, pre-programmed with other ways of thinking. I would learn Muddle from scratch. I honestly think that was a bad move. I pretty quickly learned that I was not really destined to be a great computer programmer. I don't think the way programmers think. I tend to make intuitive leaps and then check them, as opposed to dividing problems up into tiny little pieces and then work on those pieces. And so one of the things I did very early on was I started complaining about the documentation. And in standard MIT fashion, they said, feel free, write new documentation. So that ended up being my primary project, as I wrote the primer for Muddle.
So you were described as Infocom's original beta tester. I was wondering how you discovered games and ended up in that role.
So one of the reasons they chose me is because I wasn't a gamer. Everyone else they knew had already played Zork. They had created it on the mainframes at MIT 2 years earlier, and I had never played it. Partly I just didn't have time. Partly I didn't like getting addicted to new things. So I kind of avoided it. And so, I mean, they knew me fairly well. We were all friends and we were all involved with the film series at MIT and whatever. And so they asked if I was willing to, and I wouldn't call myself a beta tester really. I was really the only tester, and I was, kind of an alpha tester. So they were developing it on a remote Deck System 20 that they were renting from, I think it was from Digital Equipment actually. And I would have to log in over like a 300 baud modem and play the game and then report problems that I was running into, or even suggestions for things where I felt a problem was just too difficult and maybe I suggest a second solution, like more than one alternative solution, just to make it a little more likely that somebody could actually get past that problem. So, I played the game hundreds and hundreds of times to the point where I could literally type my way through it in about 15 minutes. And I would actually dream moving through that game.
Do you think it made it a bit easier not being a kind of gamer and, made it easier for new players to get involved? Whereas if someone was a gamer, they may have, been a bit more kind of straight into there and a bit more advanced on it?
Yeah, I don't know if it was so much a gamer, because a lot of the problems were sort of, weird cultural references. There's a problem where the solution is to, ring a bell, read a book, and light a candle because of the bell, book, and candle. And, it was not something that I don't think I had ever run across. And I'm not sure that would be a gamer-related, reference that they would say, oh, of course, it's bell, book, and candle, right? So there were things like that where I was pushing back.
Well, that became a big part of what you did, helping users learn how to play Zork and sharing tips. And actually, you founded the Zork user group. So what was the story there, and why did you set it up?
So I fairly quickly started pushing Infocom as I was testing the game, and as they started selling Zork 1, and I was then testing Zork 2. We started fairly quickly getting, folks contacting us saying, they needed help. And so I suggested that we provide some help. And I was willing to provide a hint service. And so I initially was doing that through Infocom. They were paying me an hourly rate, and I was, typing up answers to folks literally on a manual typewriter using carbons. And we put a little slip of paper in, if you go down through the trap door, and I think you went like one room south or southeast or something from there, there was a piece of paper crammed into a crack in the wall. If you pulled it out, it mentioned that there was a heuristic information for novice travelers service, HINTS, and a movement assistance planner service, MAPS. And if you sent a postcard or whatever to a P.O. box in Cambridge, we would send you further information on how to acquire the hints or the maps. So it was this difficult process for folks. They had to find that little slip of paper in the wall. They had to send off to a P.O. box. We then sent them an order form back and instructions on like how to go about it. And then they'd send their questions in with a check to that P.O. box, and then I would answer the questions. So I started doing that, and was simultaneously applying to business schools, because I had concluded that I wasn't going to be a programmer, that what I was doing running the film series at MIT, which was by the way, the biggest student activity on campus and the most, we had the deepest finances. I mean, in today's terms, adjusting for inflation, probably like a $300,000 a year revenue stream. It was running a business basically. And I concluded that that's what I was interested in and good at, and I should get a credential. So I applied to business schools. I got into University of Chicago. Well, I got into some others also, but that's the one I chose, and started pushing on Joel and Mark that they should hire my roommate, Steve Moretsky, to take over as tester and doing the other things I was doing, like answering the hints. They thought that there were higher priorities, like hiring a marketing person and hiring a salesperson or whatever, before they would consider hiring somebody like Moretsky. And they said, if you think it's such a great idea, we'll sign a contract with you right now. Why don't you just start a company and do it yourself? And I said, okay. So we wrote a fairly simple contract. It gave me all the rights to all of their IP other than making games. So I could have written books, I could have done TV shows, movies, anything I wanted with their IP, as long as I paid them 15% of my revenues. And
that's pretty generous.
Went off to I've spent a week at my parents' home in Milwaukee, which is just 90 miles north of Chicago on Lake Michigan, and told them what I was planning to do. I was going to start this company while I was in business school. And my father had literally just retired, like 2 or 3 months before that. And he said, he really didn't have a whole lot to do. Was there a way that he could get involved? And so we talked about it. And I said, well, if you'd like to handle the actual logistics day to day, taking in the checks, ordering, dealing with anything that, needed to be sent out. I was planning to actually become a mail order source for the games in addition to providing these other services. So he agreed to that and sent out the very first newsletter. Infocom had agreed to provide me with all the warranty cards that they had ever received or any other information where they got a name and address. And so they gave me 700 warranty cards. I think at the time they had sold about 4,000 copies of Zork 1, gotten 700 warranty cards back. And so we did a mailing. I came home for Thanksgiving from business school, and we did a mailing to 700 folks. And 100 of them placed an order, which is an insanely high response rate for direct mail, especially from someone you've never heard of before who's not giving their name or a phone number, just a P.O. box and telling me to send a check. So we sold 100 copies of Zork 2, which was just coming out, and I was in business. So I talked the University of Chicago into making me a computer operator so I could get access to the one good terminal they had, which was the computer operator's terminal, which was behind a locked door, so that I could use the higher end editing software that we had from MIT. I basically brought out a tape with the source code and loaded it into their computer so I could use R mode, because by that point I had automated answering the hints, because they tended to ask the same questions over and over again, and typing those all up was a pain in the ass. So I created a bunch of abbreviations in R mode where I would just type in a few letters and a whole question and answer would pop up. So I could very, very quickly answer these hints. And I was able to answer the hints at the rate of about $25 an hour, which in 1981, that's equivalent to about $75 an hour now, which is not bad for a student, right? But it was still boring as hell. So I decided I needed to create some sort of a hint booklet, and was really struggling with how to go about doing that. I didn't want it to be easily copied. I didn't want it to be easily passed along. I was really worried about piracy. So I wanted something that was semi-self-destructive and not easily copied. And eventually, there's a long story, but eventually came up with the idea for InvisiClues and created the InvisiClues books, which just took off. The sales of those and the profit margins on those were just tremendous.
Well, when Zork kind of came to the personal computer, did you see a huge boost on it? And also, being on mainframes before, was it harder for people to kind of get time to actually play games? And what was the attitude around people gaming on mainframes back then?
Well, the mainframe version, the computer that it was on the ARPANET, was one of the very few nodes on the ARPANET at the time. But the other nodes were at places like Stanford and Harvard and various military bases. And that computer, which was a multi-million-dollar machine, pretty much got taken over by people playing Zork on it from all over the country. There was somebody once said that Zork coming out cost the computer industry a week of productivity at the time. So from 77 to 79, to 80, that was the only way it was available. There was a guy at DEC who downloaded, there was no security on these systems. Anyone could get in and do whatever they wanted. And somebody from DEC downloaded all the source code and translated it to Fortran, which was, unbelievable. And he released it as Dungeon. And so a lot of people played it. That spread all over a whole bunch of different computer systems around the world. And so many, many, many people played it as not Zork, but Dungeon. But Zork 1 came out in fall of 80, and that was on the Apple II and then TRS-80 Model 1. I forget if they were, I don't think they were simultaneous. I think one followed the other by a couple months, and I can't remember the exact order. I think the TRS-80 might have been first. And it was being sold through a company called Personal Software, which at the same time had acquired VisiCalc. And that became their big seller, and that's what they were focused on. And so as Zork 2 was about to come out, they had a contract that would have included follow-on games from Infocom. They decided they didn't want to be doing games anymore. They were just going to focus on VisiCalc, and they even changed the name of the company to VisiCorp. And so they just gave all the rights and all the inventory back to Infocom to get out of the contract. And so fall of 81, as Zork 2 was about to come out, Infocom had to decide how they were going to proceed, and they decided that they would just self-publish. So they raised a bit more money from the founders and created the packaging for Zork 1 and Zork 2 and a couple of ads and launched it. And so that's really what got Infocom going. And most people then played on the various microcomputer versions. Initially Apple II and TRS-80, but fairly quickly they started adding other machines. One of the big advantages of the way Infocom did things was they wrote a language that was a subset of Muddle that they wrote all the games in, and then they wrote interpreters for the individual machines to run that language. So they didn't have to change the game at all, machine to machine. They just, once they had an interpreter, all the games ran on that machine. So it was a very efficient way of programming these games, and it allowed them to very quickly come out on new computers as they were launched. So we very often had the only games available for a new computer because of the way they went about it. For instance, when the Mac came out, I think fairly quickly we had all 12 games running on the Mac, and there was virtually nothing else available for the Mac. So for a while we had a monopoly.
Well, you joined Infocom full-time and ended up, essentially heading their marketing department. So what was kind of the story there then? How did you end up taking on that full-time position?
So they had been they hired a marketing guy who didn't work out and went off and started another actually quite successful company. And then they started looking for somebody to replace him. This was while I was in business school. And they found someone who wanted to wait a few months before starting, and then like a day or two before he was supposed to start, he, said, no, I'm not going to do it. And so by then I was into my second year of business school, and Zork Users Group was doing really, really well. And, I knew the games inside out. I knew the customers better than they did in many ways because I was dealing with them. And so they decided that it would be better to wait for me to graduate and hire me as the marketing guy than to try to find somebody else in the meantime. So we all agreed I would sell them the Zork Users Group and come back to Cambridge and head up marketing.
Well, the adventure genre grew massively as the 80s went along and with the rise of microcomputers. How did Infocom take on other companies that were around at that time and coming through like Sierra and Lucasfilm Games?
Yeah, so I remember one of the ads that we did, I think it was fall of 83, maybe even a little earlier than that. We really aggressively went after the graphic adventure games, which were primarily coming from Sierra. And I don't know if you've seen, if you do a Google search, I'm sure you can find examples of them, like, would you shell out $1,000 to match wits with this? And it has this blocky, really ridiculously looking character that was all you could do on these computers at the time. And we just pointed out that we weren't wasting the, very limited resources of the computers on trying to do crappy graphics like that. We were pouring it into, more interesting, deeper puzzles and more content. And I know, I'm blanking on his name now, Williams. What was his first name? Sierra's CEO.
Ken
Williams. Yes, thank you. Yeah, he wrote us a letter. He was really upset about our advertising campaign, that we were, essentially trashing his games. We never said anything about his games, but, he was the main purveyor of those sorts of games. He was really upset, and he actually wrote in the letter that, we were nearly killing his company. Obviously, they recovered and they did okay. But initially we were, I would say, for about the first 3 or 4 years, the dominant publisher of computer games. If you, we have a bunch of these things in our files, but the primary distributor of games at the time was called SoftCell, and they had about 40% of the market overall, I would say. They were selling to all the ma and pa computer stores, which were the primary retail channels. SoftCell had the hot list, which came out every week. And Infocom just dominated that list in the games category. For a while they had the top 50. They eventually, as they added other categories, they dropped that to the top 30. But we have charts where all 12 of our games are in the top 30, and we have 3 games in the top 10, and we almost always had number 1 or number 2 on that list. For a long time, Invisiclues took over when we started selling those independently from Infocom. They took over the entire book list. There were 10 books, and it was all Invisiclues. So the other book folks complained to SoftSell and said, you should just combine all the Invisiclues into one and let us have some spots on that list. So they did. And then from that point on, Invisiclues was always just number 1 on the books list.
You actually got some massive franchises that you turned into video games. one that stands out in my mind as an interesting experience, something that was probably the most frustrating game I ever played. I nearly I had it on the Amiga, and I threw my Amiga 500 out the window several times, and that was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I imagine that was a massive game for Infocom. Have you kind of got any memories of that project that stand out then, and why was that game so difficult?
I could talk for hours just on that. Yeah, so, I was heading up marketing, and we get... essentially, Douglas Adams gets in touch with us and says, I'd like to do Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game with you guys. And I'm like, I was a huge fan of Hitchhikers. So were virtually everybody else at Infocom. Definitely wanted to do that game. I thought it would be by far a number 1 bestseller. And getting to work with Douglas Adams, wow, what could be better, right? So the problem was that none of the game developers at Infocom wanted to do it. And it wasn't because they didn't like the property. It's because they all had their own ideas about games they wanted to do, and they didn't want to give up a slot, one of their ideas, to do somebody else's, where they figured that person was going to get the lion's share of the credit. And up to that point in time, we had never identified the game author on the packaging. We basically took the position that these were Infocom games, that they were done by a whole, there was a whole team involved, even though there was one key author behind it. We didn't put their names on any of the packaging. And so the way I convinced Steve Moretsky to take on doing Hitchhikers, because he really didn't want to do it initially, was I said, I will give you equal credit. I will make sure you are in the press tour with Douglas. I will put both of your names on the package. And so he agreed. Douglas was not thrilled that he was getting what he viewed as a secondary game author. He wanted to work with Mark Blank or Mike Berlin. The first Infocom game he had played was Suspended by Mike Berlin. He thought it was brilliant, and he wanted to work with Mike. Well, Mike and Mark didn't want to do a collaboration. So I found Steve as the alternative. I also thought he was the best choice because he was so good at comedy, and I thought he would work really well with Douglas. But yeah, it was quite a undertaking to actually get that even started. And then Douglas, as he would be first to admit, was a world-class procrastinator. And Steve is the most buttoned up, on schedule. He can focus on something, no matter what is happening around him, he can dive right in and be creative. So he found it really frustrating that Douglas couldn't do that. And so it wasn't the easiest collaboration. But at the very end, Steve was really honored by Douglas saying to them that he could not tell what he himself had written versus what Steve had written, that Steve had done such a good job of imitating his style in the things that Steve put in, that Douglas couldn't remember what he did versus what Steve did.
Was that difficulty curve complained much by users? Were they getting in touch?
Oh, definitely. And so many people would write in saying, greatest game I ever played. How do I get past the, and it would be something that was like 3% into the game, like getting the, now I'm blanking on the translator. out of the vendor.
The Babel.
The Babelfish. Yeah.
Yeah.
How do I get the Babelfish? It's like, okay, this is the greatest game you've ever played, and you haven't seen 97% of the game yet. Right? And there were even people who hadn't gotten off the planet Earth who were writing in. I actually made the Babelfish problem significantly easier in my feedback on it because I thought it was way too hard. And they did accept my input. I made it somewhat easier, but it was still insanely hard. I don't know if you remember, but there were all these steps to getting the Babelfish, right? You had to deal with the floor cleaning robot, and then there was a flying robot, and you had to put the mail on the floor cleaning robot or whatever, and then you had to block the exit panel that it went through, such that it crashed into it, and the mail went flying up in the air or whatever. Initially, the only thing that worked in terms of overwhelming the up in the air robot was multiple items, and the pile of mail was the thing that worked. So if you put anything else there, that flying robot got it, and you were just stymied. And I said, why don't we at least add a hint that the flying robot wasn't overwhelmed by only one piece? But you get an idea, maybe if I had multiple pieces there, it might be overwhelmed. And so they accepted that and put it in. Douglas was upset that was making it way too easy. It was still way too hard, as you know.
Any hints like that were massively appreciated from the players. I speak from personal experience. And I mean, as we kind of went into the 80s, obviously Activision took over the company in 1986. And then shortly after, it was only a couple of years in 89 when Infocom closed. So what kind of, in your opinion, caused the kind of end of the company? And what were those later days like after Activision took over and until the end of the company?
Yeah, that was a difficult time. So as you probably know, Infocom was also working on a business product line. And that was really what most of the founders were interested in when they started the company. There were 10 founders of Infocom. So, there were a few that were focused on games, but I'd say, kind of the majority and sort of the focus of the chairman of the board, Al Vezza, was to get into business products. In some ways, I think some of them even found it almost embarrassing that the company became so well known for games, because that wasn't their own interest or even vision of themselves. And so, they didn't want to tell their friends that they ran a game company. They wanted to be, doing something interesting with, a prominent, business product, right? So all the profits that were being made on the game side were being channeled into creating this Cornerstone program, which, by the way, was a great program, but it was, I always thought, a mistake. And I said this many times before the game even the business product came out. I thought it was a mistake having them both under the same company, under the same brand name. I said it's going to confuse consumers when we come out with a business product, because it's not at all how they perceive the company. I know you perceive the company in that way, but that's not what the market perceives the company as. And I think it's going to hurt the game side, and I think it's going to hurt the business side. And I think I was right, by the way. So Cornerstone came out the beginning of 85, was it 85? And got fantastic reviews. The people who bought it loved it. But that was a year of retrenchment in the tech industry. And we'd had a whole bunch of companies offering to buy us up to that point in time or invest in us. Well, we didn't really need the money at the time. And the board was not very business savvy. They were mostly academics. And they were like, oh, we don't need it now. Let's wait. Well, one of the things you learn in business is when money's available, grab it, because you don't know that it's going to be available when you really need it. And when you really need it, they start decreasing their offers, right? Because they can sense that you really need it. So unfortunately, with the downturn in the tech industry that year and the drop in the stock market for tech stocks and whatever, and the fact that Cornerstone wasn't selling quite as well, it was time to go raise money. Well, then the companies that had been offering high values earlier started offering lower values. And the chairman of the board was very upset about that. And he would get all annoyed and walk away, right? then he'd go back a couple months later when he was more desperate and say, okay, I'll take that offer. And they're like, well, that was then. Now we're only going to offer this. And he'd walk away frustrated again. And so we basically ran out of money. And they had to shut down the Cornerstone project altogether and find a home for the games business. And there were still people interested in buying that. But, we had a $32 million offer, which, by the way, adjusting for inflation is about $100 million now for the games business in the 1984 timeframe. Simon & Schuster wanted to buy us. Simon & Schuster published Douglas Adams books. They saw that we were selling really well in bookstores like B. Dalton and Walden Books at the time. And so they thought that this was a new industry. They should get a foot in that door and that we were the obvious way to do it. They offered a ton of money, and the chairman turned them down. Approximately a year later, when we were desperate, Activision offered $2 million to the shareholders, and that's what they took. By then, there were a bunch of debts also. So Activision actually had to shell out more like $8 million because there was about $6 million in debts to pay off. So we got rescued by being bought by Activision. Activision was blowing through the money that they had made off of selling cartridges before the cartridge meltdown in 83. And they had gone public, I think, in 83 and raised a bunch of money. So they had a pile of money that they were burning through. And, some of that was used to buy Infocom. And they decided they wanted to get into computer games instead of being on the cartridge side of things. And the executive committee that bought us, we got along with great. We liked them. They liked us. But within a year, all of those people had been canned. The founder, CEO, Jim Levy, was kicked out, and his entire team was fired. And Bruce Davis, who had been brought in by the board as a consultant, took over. He had been opposed to buying Infocom before it was purchased and was very negative about Infocom. And so we kind of went through a fairly difficult couple of years under him. And, they were burning through the rest of their money and had to shut down a lot of operations and consolidate. So one of the things they ended up shutting down was Infocom. But in the meantime, they had done things that really, in my opinion, had hurt us. For instance, we were doing 4 or 5 games a year. The industry, by then, the computers were getting better graphics and more memory and better CPUs. And so the expectation of what would be in a game was moving up. And, on the marketing side of things, we were saying, we need to invest more in the new titles. We need to do more in order to be competitive. But he was pushing us to spend much less on each game. And he wanted us to do 8 games a year instead of 4 with the same staff. So, we were being pushed in pretty strongly in a direction of cutting back on what we were putting in instead of adding more. And that was a death spiral. The other thing he did was half of our sales came from our older titles. And that's where the real profits came from. It's kind of like the book industry where your backlist is where you really make a ton of money. And you use that to try to, do a bunch of experiments and hope to create another title that makes it to the backlist that's an ongoing sales success. So that's how we ran the company. That's how we did our marketing and everything. He decided that anything older than about a year should just be pulled off the shelves and more room made for new titles. But that really hurt our whole business model. And so I don't think we ever really recovered from that.
Well, in 1994, the kind of multimedia age was in full swing, and you ended up co-founding Bofo Games with Steve Moretsky. What was the kind of focus of that company, and what was the story there?
So Steve had been doing some games for a company called Legend. Bob Bates had started Legend. Bob had done, I think, 2 games for Infocom as an outside contractor. So he did... I know he did Arthur, and I think he did one other, and I'm blanking on that. But Bob, when Infocom shut down, started Legend, and then did a deal with Steve for Steve to do some games for Legend. So Steve did the Spellcasting series and Superhero League of Hoboken for Legend. And, he was enjoying what he was doing, but Legend wasn't doing particularly well. Steve was not making, a terrible amount of money working for them. And he had, the vision of it's time to start another company. And so he asked me if I would be willing to help him do that, and I was. So we got the company started by, I saw an article in the press that MediaVision, which was one of the early CD-ROM hardware companies, and those CD-ROM companies, if you remember, were bundling a lot of games and software with the CD-ROM when they sold the, several $100 piece of hardware. They concluded that, I think they were paying something like $1 a game, and then, putting 1 million copies of the games, in with the CD-ROM. They took the point of view, hey, we could actually create our own games for less than we're spending on all these licensing fees. Not realizing that they were able to pick and choose from the 1 in 1,000 games that actually succeeded. And then now we're going to get in the industry where they were taking that 1 in 1,000 risk on creating those games. And so they announced in the press that they were putting $50 million aside to start publishing games, and that they'd hired a team of folks. And they mentioned who was on this team. And I said, I know that guy. So I got in touch and said, hey, if you're heading up this, new team to create games, we're starting this company. How would you like to talk to us about working with us? And they immediately agreed. Steve and I flew out to California to meet with them. And back in that period of time, there was a Saturday night stayover discount on airfares. It was kind of aimed at, business travelers didn't want to give up their weekend, but, more casual travelers would be willing to, give up part of the weekend in order to get a discount. Well, Steve and I, starting a company, were perfectly interested in discounts. So we flew out on Saturday for a Monday morning meeting and spent Sunday down at Disneyland. It was like 80 degrees and gorgeous. And we, of course, this was January, I think, 18th, 1994. Santa Ana winds, beautiful weather. We'd come from, freezing cold Boston. We didn't even have, short sleeve shirts with us. So we're walking around Disneyland, dying of the heat, with all these people going by in shorts and flip-flops. And the next morning at like 5:30 in the morning, the earthquake hit. And we were not far from the epicenter from the Northridge quake. I thought we were dead. I didn't think a building could stand that kind of shaking and not fall down. But later that day, we managed to get together with the folks who are all coming in and telling their stories about, what they'd gone through that day. And Steve started in on his 21 game ideas. Now, as a marketing guy, I always said, just pick one and sell them on it. They don't want to hear 21 ideas because they can't choose between them. They want to know what you think is the best. But, it's really hard to control Steve. So he went through his 21 ideas, and some of them get pretty crazy. They went off and huddled and came back and said, all right, we'd like to do 11 of those. How would you like to get your company going? And how quickly do you think you could do what? And so Steve and I huddled for a little bit, and we said, okay, we think we can do one small one in year 1. We can do 2 in year 2 and 3 in year 3. And they said, okay, we'll sign the contract right now for a 6-title deal with you. They handed us a check. We had nothing in writing. But they said, look, because we had not raised any money at all, and we had no employees, we had no equipment, we had nothing. They said, go back to Boston and start buying equipment and start hiring people, and we'll get the contract done within a month. So they did. They got the contract done. We started working on Hodge and Podge. And we, about a month or two later, started seeing headlines in the Wall Street Journal, SEC and FBI investigating MediaVision. It was like, oh no. Their stock dropped from like 44 to 4 in a matter of days. They had shareholder lawsuits. Turns out the execs, not the guys we were dealing with, but the higher execs, had completely cooked the books. They were moving inventory from warehouse to warehouse and calling it sales. They had completely fraudulently raised money on Wall Street. I mean, they ended up going to jail. So the company was killed, but our game was far enough along that they sold it. But of course, the company that bought it very soon afterwards had a complete reorganization, and the new management said, "Why did we buy this?" So they launched it, but without a lot of backing. And we kind of went through that several times at Bafo. We did a deal. I did a talk at the Game Developer Conference once about kind of how difficult it is to get a game company going, and pointed out that even with somebody as prominent and successful as Steve Moretsky, it's not easy. And I pointed out we did 16 handshake deals for games with different companies, where they said, "We've got a deal. Go. We're going to do this." 10 of those became letters of intent. 6 of those became contracts. 2 of those actually made it to market. And there's a lot of stories behind all of that. But it's not an easy industry to be in. These companies often end up reorganizing. We did a deal with Time Warner where I thought, okay, it's a $30 billion company at the time. It's not going to go under on us. But, a year into working on the game, they shut down Time Warner Interactive completely, fired all the people, and killed all the games. So even with a company as solid as that, you don't know what's going to happen.
And I imagine by this era, we're talking mid-90s, CD-ROM is the main delivery of games, and the games are much bigger than they were on floppy disks. I imagine the resources to make these titles and the teams you needed must have been much bigger than they were in the 80s, for example.
Oh, absolutely. In the 80s, we were dealing with, Zork 1 and the first games at Infocom, we had to fit in 81K. A postage stamp size graphic on a computer game these days is more than that, right? So the entire 40-hour game ran in 81K and with 32K of memory. By the time period of like Spacebar, which came out in 97, that game was on 3 CDs, 3 650 megabyte CDs. So it was like a little, just almost 2 gigabytes. So, what is that? 2,000, 20,000, 25,000 times the size of Zork 1 in terms of just disk space. And we had a whole team of we had several programmers, an outside art firm working with us, an outside animation firm working with us. You needed whole teams even then. Nowadays, you can have teams of hundreds or even thousands working on a game. They can cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce. But, that was a couple $1 million game development cost. In Infocom days, it would be one implementer, spending about a year. And then, the overhead associated with it of testing and marketing and whatever. But I was basically accounting in the early days at Infocom for about $300,000 per game to get a game finished. And that was way more than our competitors were spending. We were definitely, a lot of that was also, though, in the marketing side of things. The actual game development part of that was probably, 100,000 or less.
Well, you mentioned Spacebar as well then, and that was a very unique mixture of like adventure, puzzle, and humor. What's the story behind that game?
It was one of the 21 ideas that Steve threw out from day one. He had a whole bunch of incredible ideas. He had a great storyline for a Titanic game, and we actually pitched that before even knowing that Cameron was doing a movie. Had it picked up by Broderbund, and unfortunately, then that also ended up falling through. But we pitched Spacebar. I'm trying to think the exact time frame. I think it would have been probably late '94, and Microsoft said yes. And we had a handshake with Microsoft, who was at the time probably the best publisher of games in terms of, you could count on them coming through. They didn't cancel things arbitrarily. They actually paid milestones on time. And they had never launched a game that sold less than 300,000 copies, which was a big plus, right? So we had an agreement with Microsoft. I flew back to Boston, and the next day, Steve met the rocket science guys, and he told them about Spacebar. And Ron Cobb was one of the founders of rocket science. Ron, early claim to fame was he was a comic strip producer or artist for a free newspaper in San Francisco. You can imagine how much money somebody like that ends up making, right? So, he was a starving artist, but he apparently was really good at creating aliens in that comic strip. So this up and coming movie producer in the Bay Area had decided that his film was lacking something, and he went to Ron and said, could you create like a bar scene with a whole bunch of aliens in it? And Ron said yes. And for $1,000, Ron Cobb created the cantina scene in Star Wars. Now, in retrospect, you could say, wow, he was really underpaid. But it did make his name. And so he got a bunch of other gigs. And one of his gigs was Steven Spielberg, who's a friend of Lucas, had him do significant work on E.T. and gave him 1 point of E.T. So he made many, many millions of dollars just on E.T. And he did quite a few other projects. I don't know if any of them did as well as E.T. did, but he did a bunch of work for Cameron. Like he did, he was an art director on Aliens. I forget all the other films he worked on. But anyway, Steve met him, decided that the space bar, Steve had already sketched out all the aliens in the game and had written like a 1-page description of them and their culture and their place in the universe. But meeting Ron, he said, Ron is going to do so much better job of then taking these the next step than anybody else. I want to work with rocket science. Well, my reaction to that was, the business side of things was, but we have a deal with Microsoft that is guaranteed to sell. And rocket science has never put out a game. They're a startup. Who knows how long they'll last? Who knows if they'll even be around long enough to get the game out? But Steve was convinced, and you got to kind of go with the creative sometimes. So I had to call Microsoft and say, terribly sorry, but we're going somewhere else. And they said, are you crazy? We've never sold less than 300,000 copies of any game. And I said, I know, don't rub it in. I hope you'd still consider working with us in the future. And we went with rocket science. And by the time we were finishing the game, they were running out of money. And so they sold the game to SegaSoft. And, by that point, we were pretty much convinced that 3 strikes were out. I mean, having 3 publishers go under on us was just one too many. And so we wound down the company.
So I know the Spacebar was a bit of a cult classic these days and, very well received and reviewed back in its time. I did hear that the game is getting a re-release as well. So what's kind of happened here, and why bring out a new version of it in 2022, and what's going to be new in this new version?
Yeah, so it's kind of a surprise for us also. I don't know, probably about 6 months ago, maybe a little longer, we got contacted by Bernie Stoller, who's kind of an industry legend. I think he was the original Sony exec who launched the first PlayStation. And I know he had a number of other roles, but he ended up CEO of SegaSoft. And so he was there when they bought Spacebar from Rocket Science and launched it. And I have to admit, I kind of lost contact with him. But earlier this year, he got in touch and said, SegaSoft wound down in 2000, and the rights to Spacebar reverted to you. Well, actually, that was news to us. We actually got a lawyer involved and kind of dove into it and realized, oh, I guess they did revert to us. And since Bavo had never really kind of completely, and we'd never gone bankrupt. It turns out legally, the shareholders of Bafo, which were just the three of us who founded it, legally owned the intellectual property of Bafo still, and that reverted to us. So to our surprise, we owned Spacebar, and Bernie said, "I'm working with this guy Jordan Freeman, and he's taking some of the classic games and relaunching them. And Spacebar has always been a favorite. We would like to relaunch Spacebar." And we were, thrilled and amazed. And really, can you do that? Can you get it working on modern machines? They said, yes, we can. And so we had, the original 3 CDs have virtually everything you need in order to make it work. We had some additional stuff in our own files that they were able to make use of. For instance, we had a much higher resolution version of the intro movie than was able to be put in the game back then. And so, we provided that, and hope, we found some other things in the files that they're going to be able to include. But it's pretty much the same game. I know as of a few days ago, I could play it. I haven't actually tried doing that yet. And hopefully it's going to be launched fairly soon. It just kind of has to get through a few, I think it's pretty much debugged already, but it'd be good to have, for instance, Steve Moretsky play through it and make sure we're happy with it before we give them the go-ahead.
Well, that's very exciting news. And I think, it's always amazing when kind of cult classics like that are opened up to a wider audience, and even new generations coming along and being able to discover them as well is really exciting. So, yeah, that's definitely amazing news. So we'll link up any information on that in the show notes as well. Now, I think, Mike, from what we've talked about over the last hour or so, for a lot of people, that would be kind of their entire career summarized. But obviously, there is much more that you've worked on. So if you don't mind joining us next week, we'd love to go into more detail about maybe some games that people may have heard of. Guitar Hero and Rock Band, to name but a couple.
I'd be happy to.
Fantastic. Well, we'll speak then.
All righty.